Hello and welcome back to Sleep Alchemist. Tonight, our story takes us to a quiet corner of an old city, to a dusty shop where memories abound in leather and gold. It is a story that reminds us that the greatest love affairs are not always lived, but are sometimes found, whispered from the silent pages of a forgotten book. Before we begin our journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find a sense of peace here. And in the comments, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It's always a quiet joy to see our community of listeners gathering from all corners of the globe. Now dim the lights, find your comfortable space and let your breath slow to the rhythm of the night. Our story begins with the soft chime of a shop bell and a commission that would change a quiet life forever. My shop is a quiet place. It sits on a narrow, cobblestone street in Edinburgh, a street that the modern world has mostly forgotten. Tourists rarely wander down this way. The air here does not carry the scent of roasted coffee or exhaust fumes. It smells of history. It smells of old leather, of the sharp, vinegary tang of bookbinding paste, and the faint, sweet perfume of aging paper. For 60 years, this small, dusty room has been my entire world. I am a bookbinder. It is a quiet title for a quiet life. People see me as a craftsman, a tradesman who works with his hands. But in my heart, I have always seen myself as something else. A doctor for books. They come to me wounded, their spines broken, their pages loose and yellowed with age. They come with their stories, their souls, threatening to spill out and be lost to time. And my job is to heal them. I stitch their pages together with strong linen thread. I mend their broken backs with new leather. I give them a new skin to protect the soul within. It is a slow, patient, and deeply sacred work. Every book has a story, and not just the one written in ink on its pages. It has the story of the hands that held it, the tears that may have fallen upon it, the love that it represented. My work is to honor all of those stories. The bell above my shop door has a small, delicate chime. It is a sound I know well. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in autumn, many years ago, it rang with a note that seemed different, clearer, softer. I looked up from the page I was mending. A woman stood in the doorway, shaking the rain from her dark cloak. She was young, perhaps not yet 30, and she moved with a quiet, elegant grace that seemed to fill the dusty, cluttered space with a light of its own. She was dressed in the deep, respectful black of mourning, a fine veil partially obscuring a face that was pale and beautiful, but etched with a profound, recent sorrow. She looked around the shop, at the towering presses, the rolls of leather, the stacks of marbled end papers, her eyes taking in the ordered chaos of my world. "Mr. Elias?" she asked, her voice as soft as the rain outside. "I am he," I replied, my own voice rough with the dust of my trade. "My name is Isabel, Mrs. Isabel Vance. I was told you are the best." She stepped forward and placed a heavy, cloth-wrapped bundle on my workbench. Her hands were gloved in fine black leather, and they trembled just slightly as she untied the knot. She pulled back the cloth, revealing a thick stack of loose parchment pages. They were covered in handwriting, a strong, passionate, slightly chaotic hand. The ink, a bold, dark black. "These," she said, her voice catching for a moment before she steadied it. "On my husband's poems. He was a poet. He passed away last month." I nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on the pages. I did not need to be told. I could feel the life, the energy, still humming from them. The pages themselves seemed to hold the warmth of the hand that had written them. "He always meant to have them bound," she continued, her gloved finger gently touching the edge of the top page. "He wanted a single volume, a place where all his words could live together. He used to say that a poem isn't truly finished until it has a home to rest in." A sad, beautiful smile touched her lips. "I would like to give him that home. I want you to create a book for him, something beautiful, something that will last forever." I looked from the pages to her face. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, a deep, beautiful gray, full of a grief so vast I felt I could fall into it. In that moment, I understood. This was not a simple commission. This was not a business transaction. This was a final act of love, a wife's attempt to build an eternal monument for the man she had lost. And she had come to me, a simple craftsman, to be her architect. The weight of the task settled upon me. It was a sacred trust. "I would be honored, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice softer than before. I spent the rest of the afternoon with her, a quiet consultation that felt more like a religious service. We did not speak much of her husband. Instead, we spoke of the book itself. I showed her the different kinds of leather, the soft, supple calfskin, the sturdy, honest goatskin, the rich, deep-colored Morocco. She touched each one with a quiet reverence. I showed her the marbled end papers, each sheet a unique, swirling galaxy of color. I explained the process of sewing the signatures, of tooling the spine with gold leaf, of shaping the cover. She listened with an intense, focused attention, her sad eyes full of a new, quiet purpose. After she left, the small bell above the door ringing a final, lonely chime, the shop felt quieter than ever before. The scent of her light, floral perfume lingered in the dusty air, a strange and beautiful ghost. On my workbench, the stack of her husband's poems waited. I did not touch them right away. I simply sat in my chair as the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the window, and I looked at them. I, who had spent a lifetime holding the stories of others, felt a profound sense of reverence for the story that had just been placed in my hands. This would not be just another book. This would be a vow, my vow, as a craftsman, to honor theirs as lovers. That night, long after the city had fallen asleep, I lit a single, tall candle, and with hands that felt both old and young again, I picked up the first page, and I began to read. The work of a bookbinder begins not with a needle and thread, but with an act of listening. A book must be understood before it can be healed. And so, my nights, for the first week after Mrs. Vance's visit, were spent not at my workbench, but in my old armchair by the fire, with her husband's soul resting in my hands. Each night, I would allow myself to read only one or two of his poems. To read more would have felt like a gluttony, a rushing of a sacred process. The fire would cast a low, warm light on the pages, and the only other sound would be the soft, steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. And in that quiet space, I began to meet the man known as Alistair Vance. His words were not the quiet, measured words of a scholar. They were a force of nature. They were alive. He wrote of the sea, not as a placid body of water, but as a wild, passionate creature, its waves a reflection of the turmoil in his own heart. He wrote of the city, not of its grand buildings, but of the lonely faces in the crowds and the secret stories hidden in the gaslight. And most of all, he wrote of her, of Isabel. He did not write of her beauty in simple terms. He wrote of the way her laughter was the only cure for the city's grey melancholy. He wrote of the colour of her eyes, comparing them not to jewels, but to the deep, mysterious waters of a highland loch just before a storm. He wrote of the curve of her neck, of the way her hand looked when holding a teacup, of the scent of her hair, which he said was like wild honey and the promise of summer. One poem, I remember, was just about her hands. He wrote, "My love, your hands are maps of a gentler world, where every line's a path I long to know. They speak a language, silently unfurled, of quiet strength, where tender mercies grow." Reading those words, I, a man whose own hands were calloused and stained from a lifetime of labor, felt a profound sense of connection to this poet. He saw the world with an artist's eye, and he loved with an artist's soul, completely, fiercely, and with an attention to the smallest, most beautiful details. I found myself admiring him, this ghost in the ink. I felt a strange and quiet envy for the sheer, unbridled force of his feelings. He was a man who had truly lived and truly loved. And as I read, the pile of loose papers on my lap began to feel less like a commission and more like a conversation with a friend I would never meet. After a week of this quiet communion, Mrs. Vance returned to the shop. The small bell above the door chimed, its sound as delicate as her presence. The rain had stopped, and a pale afternoon light filtered into the shop, illuminating the dust in the air. She had removed her veil, and I could see her face more clearly. The deep sadness was still there in her eyes, but there was a new resolve in the set of her jaw. "Mr. Elias," she began, her voice soft, "I have come to discuss the materials." "Of course, Mrs. Vance," I said, leading her to the great workbench where I had laid out the samples. This was a familiar ritual for me, but with her, it felt different. It felt significant. I showed her the leathers. I let her run her fingers over the rich, deep blue Morocco leather, its surface pebbled and firm. I showed her the soft, supple calfskin, the color of warm caramel, which yielded to the touch. She handled each piece with a quiet reverence, as if choosing the final resting place for a king. I showed her the end papers, my collection of beautiful, hand-marbled sheets from Italy. I laid them out like a deck of tarot cards, each one a swirling galaxy of color and pattern. There was one with deep blues and veins of brilliant gold, like a night sky. Another with soft greens and earthy browns, like a forest floor. She was drawn to the blue and gold one. "This one," she whispered, her finger tracing a golden vein. "He loved the stars." And then I took a chance. "I read his poem about the stars," I said quietly. "The one where he calls them God's forgotten jewels." Her head shot up, her grey eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, the profound sadness in them was replaced by a flash of genuine, brilliant light, a real smile. It transformed her entire face. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, grey rain. "You read that one," she said, her voice full of a soft wonder. "He wrote it after a night we spent on the coast. He stayed up until dawn, just watching the sky. He came in the next morning, his fingers stained with ink, and his eyes full of that same light I see in this paper." She told me the story, a small, simple anecdote about that night, about the cold wind, the flask of hot tea they shared, the way he had been so lost in the beauty of the cosmos that he had forgotten everything else. As she spoke, the man from the poems, the ghost of Alistair Vance, became real to me in a way he hadn't before. He was no longer just words on a page. He was a memory, alive and warm in the heart of the woman standing before me. In that moment, as we stood there looking at the swirling patterns of the marbled paper, a connection was forged. We were no longer just a craftsman and a client. We were two people, a stranger and a widow, united in our shared admiration for the soul of a poet. We were the keepers of his memory. She chose the deep blue leather and the end papers with the golden stars. After she left, the shop felt quiet, but no longer empty. It was filled with the lingering presence of her story, of his poems. I looked at the stack of his words, and then at the chosen materials lying beside them. My task was clear. I was not just binding a book of poetry. I was building a home for a great love, a silent cathedral made of leather and paper, a place where a poet's soul could rest and where a widow's heart could come to pray. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it would be the most important work of my life. With the story of the poet and his lady now living in my mind, the physical act of binding their book became a different kind of work. It was no longer a simple craft of mending and preserving. It became a sacred act of creation, of building a home for two souls. Every choice I made, every material I selected, was a quiet conversation with them. The first and most important choice was the leather for the cover. I laid out my finest pieces on the great workbench. A sturdy, honest brown calfskin, a rich, deep burgundy goatskin. But my hand, almost of its own accord, kept returning to a single roll of Morocco leather I had been saving for a truly special commission. Its color was a deep, dark blue, the color of the North Sea under a stormy sky, the color of Mrs. Vance's eyes when she spoke of her husband. I knew, in that moment, that it had to be this one. It was a choice my heart made, not my head. To wrap his passionate words in the color of her quiet, grieving eyes seemed right. It felt like the first line in a new, unspoken poem. My own secret dedication, hidden in plain sight. The next days were spent in the quiet, meditative rhythm of my craft. I took the loose pages of poetry and carefully folded them into signatures, small booklets of 8 pages each. I pressed them under the weight of the great iron press, making them flat and uniform. Then came the sewing. This is the true heart of a book. It is what gives it strength, what turns a chaotic stack of loose leaves into a unified whole. I sat at my bench for hours, my needle and strong linen thread rising and falling, stitching one signature to the next. Stitch, a poem about her laughter. Stitch, a poem about their walks by the sea. Stitch, a poem about the unbearable beauty of her sleeping face. With every pull of the thread, I felt as if I were not just binding paper, but weaving their two lives together, creating a spine strong enough to hold the weight of their love for centuries to come. I finished sewing the text block and trimmed the edges until they were perfectly smooth. It was now a solid, unified object, a body waiting for its skin. It was then that she returned. The small bell above the door chimed, and she stepped inside, bringing with her the cool, damp air of an Edinburgh afternoon. "Mr. Elias," she said, a small, hesitant smile on her face. "I hope I am not disturbing you. I was just passing by and I wondered." "Not at all, Mrs. Vance," I said, my heart giving a small, foolish leap. "In fact, you have come at a perfect time." I gestured to the workbench where the newly sewn text block was resting. "His words are now one," I said simply. She approached the bench with a quiet reverence. She reached out a hand, not to touch the book, but as if to feel the warmth of the words within it. "It is solid," she whispered, as if surprised that something as ethereal as poetry could become so real, so tangible. "Now, we must choose the end papers," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "The beginning and the end, the first and last thing one sees." I laid out my collection of hand-marbled papers, the swirling galaxies of color we had looked at before. Her eyes went immediately to the one with the deep blues and veins of shimmering gold, the one that reminded her of the stars he loved. "That one," she said, her choice immediate and certain. "An excellent choice," I replied. I laid the sheet of paper next to the text block for her to see how they would look together. As she leaned in for a closer look, her hand, reaching out to touch the paper, brushed against my own. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. The back of her gloved fingers against my rough, calloused knuckles. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat. But in that single, silent moment, the world seemed to stop. The ticking of the 100 clocks in my shop faded into nothing. There was only the unexpected, impossible warmth of her touch. A jolt, like a spark from a flint, went through me. A feeling I had thought long dead and buried, a feeling that belonged to the young men in the books I mended, not to an old, dusty bookbinder like me. It was a feeling of possibility, a dangerous, beautiful, and utterly impossible feeling. I believe she felt it too. She drew her hand back quickly, a faint blush rising on her pale cheeks. She looked up and our eyes met. And in that moment, in that shared, charged silence, a new secret was born. Not the grand, poetic secret of the pages on the table, but a smaller, more fragile secret. A secret between a widow in mourning and an old man who was falling in love with her story. I realized then the true, complex nature of my feelings. I had fallen in love with the ghost of her husband through his beautiful words. And now I was falling in love with the quiet strength and sad, beautiful eyes of the woman he had left behind. I understood, with a clarity that was both a joy and a pain, that my role in this story was not to be a new chapter. It was to be the humble, silent binder of the old one. My love for her could only be expressed through my devotion to his memory. It was the only love I could offer, a quiet, protective, and unspoken love. The moment passed. The clocks began to tick again. "It will be beautiful," she said, her voice a little shaky, her gaze now fixed on the paper. "Yes," I replied, my own voice hoarse. "It will." She chose a simple silk ribbon, the same deep blue as the leather, to be the bookmark. We discussed the final details, the tooling on the spine, the title to be pressed in gold leaf. Our conversation was professional again, but the space between us was now filled with a new, unspoken intimacy, a shared knowledge of a spark that could never be allowed to become a flame. She left soon after, the small bell heralding her departure. The shop once again felt quiet, but this time it was not empty. It was filled with the lingering scent of her perfume and with the ghost of her touch on my hand. I looked down at the text block, at the chosen leather, at the starry end papers. The task before me was no longer just a commission. It was a sacred duty and a personal sacrifice. Creating this book, this perfect home for their love, was now the only way I could express my own. And I would make it the most beautiful thing I had ever created. The final stage of the work is always the most delicate. It is the giving of the skin, the creation of the face the book will present to the world. With the text blocks sewn and secure, I turned my attention to the cover. I cut the deep blue Morocco leather with a surgeon's precision, the sharp blade making a soft, satisfying hiss as it sliced through the material. I could smell its rich, earthy scent. The color was perfect. The color of her eyes. The color of a twilight sky holding his beloved stars. I stretched the leather over the sturdy boards, my hands working with a familiarity born of 60 years of practice. I smoothed out every wrinkle, my fingers feeling the fine, pebbled grain. This was not just a cover. It was an armor to protect the fragile heart within. Then came the gold, the final act of adornment. I heated my brass tools over a small spirit lamp, their surfaces gleaming in the dim light. With a steady hand, I picked up a sheet of gold leaf, so thin it fluttered with my own breath. I pressed the heated tools onto the foil, lifting the poet's name, letter by golden letter, and stamping it onto the deep blue of the spine. ALISTIRVANCE. Each letter was a small prayer, an act of setting his name in light, just as she would have wanted. When it was done, I polished the leather one last time with a soft cloth. I stood back and looked at it. It rested on my workbench, a perfect, silent thing. It was, I knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with pride, the finest book I had ever made. It was not just because of the quality of the materials or the skill of the work. It was because I had poured more than just my craft into it. It contained the poet's passion, the widow's grief, and my own quiet, impossible, and reverent love. The souls of 3 people were now bound together in this single, beautiful object. She came for it on a Friday. The rain had stopped, and a weak watery sunlight filtered through the shop's dusty window. She was no longer wearing the deep black of mourning. Today, she wore a simple dress of soft grey wool, a small sign of a new season in her own life. I had placed the book on a stand, covered with a piece of black velvet, like a work of art at a private viewing. When she saw it, She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. A soft, sharp intake of breath. "Oh," she whispered. It was the only word she could manage. I stepped back, giving her space. She approached the book slowly, as if it were a sleeping creature she was afraid to wake. She reached out a hand, not to pick it up, but simply to trace the golden letters of his name on the spine. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is him." "I only built the home, Mrs. Vance," I replied softly. His words provided the soul. She finally lifted the book, holding it in both hands as if it were a sacred relic. She opened the cover, and her eyes fell upon the end papers, the deep blue paper with its swirling golden stars. A single tear escaped and fell onto her gloved hand. She did not wipe it away. "He would have loved this," she said, looking up at me. Her eyes met mine, and in their stormy grey depths, I saw not just gratitude for a service rendered, but a deep, profound, and quiet understanding. She knew. I do not know how, but I know that she knew. She understood the care, the devotion that I had poured into this work. She understood the unspoken things. She paid me for my work, the transaction feeling strangely mundane after the sacredness of the moment. She wrapped the book carefully in the same cloth she had brought the loose pages in. "Thank you, Mr. Elias," she said, her hand on the door. "You have done more than bind a book. You have preserved a life." And then she was gone. The small bell above the door chimed its final, delicate farewell. I stood there in my workshop, suddenly so quiet, so empty. The space on the workbench where the book had rested seemed colder than the rest of the room. A great work was finished. A story had been given its home, and a chapter in my own life had come to a gentle, quiet close. I felt a sense of loss, yes, a deep, aching void where the purpose of the last few weeks had been. But underneath the loss, there was a profound sense of peace, of a duty fulfilled. I, Elias, the humble bookbinder, had been given a great privilege. I had been allowed to touch a great love, and in doing so, I had felt a pale echo of it in my own quiet heart. I would never have the passionate words of the poet. I would never have the beautiful sad eyes of the widow. But I had this memory. And so, I made a silent promise to them, to the two souls whose story I now knew so well. It was my own vow, the bookbinder's vow. I would be the secret keeper of their story. I would honor the love I was so privileged to witness. Their secret was safe with me, carried in the silence of my shop, for the rest of my days. That was many, many years ago. I am a very old man now. My hands are too stiff to tool leather with gold, but I still come to my shop every day. It smells the same, of paper and glue and time. I often wonder where that book is now. I hope it rests on a cherished shelf in a quiet room. I hope a daughter or a granddaughter sometimes takes it down and reads the words of her ancestor and feels the love that still lives within its beautiful, deep blue cover. The thought brings me not sadness, but a quiet, profound contentment. My life has been a simple one, a life of service to the stories of others, and that, I think, is a good life. a full life. The fire in the hearth has burned low now. The rain has stopped. The ticking of the clocks is a soft, gentle lullaby. My thoughts begin to slow, to soften. The memory of the blue leather, the glint of the golden stars, the ghost of her perfume in the dusty air, they all weave together, a gentle tapestry, a quiet craft, a life of devotion, a peaceful, final page, a deep and restful sleep. Every book is a home for a story, and every craftsman a guardian of a memory. Thank you for listening to this quiet tale of a love that was bound in leather and gold. I hope it has brought you a sense of peace and a reverence for the silent, beautiful stories that surround us all. May your rest be deep and your dreams be filled with pages of comfort and joy. Sleep well. My workshop is a quiet place. It has been my home, my sanctuary, and my confessional for over 60 years. The air in here does not change with the seasons. It always smells the same, the sharp, pine-like scent of spruce, the sweeter, warmer perfume of maple, and the deep, alcoholic tang of the varnish I mix myself from old family recipes. It is the smell of potential, the smell of music waiting to be born. I am an old man now. My hands, which were once so steady they could carve a violin scroll with the grace of a pen stroke, are now gnarled with arthritis. Their work is mostly done. I spend my days now mostly in this old leather armchair, surrounded by the ghosts of my creations. Violins and cellos in various states of completion hang from the ceiling like sleeping brown moths. The walls are lined with tools, each one a trusted friend, with its own history, its own feel in my hand. In my lap rests my masterpiece. The violin I call Enja. She has seen the world. Her voice has filled the great concert halls of Vienna, of Paris, of New York. She has been held by famous hands, praised by critics, and loved by thousands. But her heart, the soul I carved into her very wood, has always remained here, in this small, quiet shop in Cremona. Only I know her true story. My thumb, its skin as thin as parchment, gently plucks her open G-string. The note that rings out is not just a sound, it is a memory. It is deep, resonant, and full of a profound, beautiful sorrow. And in that single, vibrating note, the 60 years fall away. The dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun become the dust motes of my youth, and the door to my shop opens once more. She came on a Tuesday in spring. I remember the light was particularly soft that day. She was no more than 16, a slip of a girl with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a cascade of dark, untamed hair. She was poor. I could tell by her simple, patched dress and the worn-out shoes on her feet, and she was clutching a violin case, a cheap, battered wooden thing, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. She did not enter with the confidence of a patron. She hovered at the doorway, peering into the shadows of my shop with a look of such intense, reverent longing that it stopped me in my tracks. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the violins hanging on my wall, their varnished bodies glowing like honey in the dim light. May I just look?" she asked, her voice a shy whisper. I was a gruff man in my youth, not fond of interruptions, but there was something in her eyes, a raw hunger for the beauty of the instruments, that disarmed me. I simply nodded and returned to my work, pretending to ignore her. She stepped inside, moving through my shop with the quiet grace of a forest creature. She did not touch anything. She simply looked, her eyes wide with a kind of holy awe. She would pause before each violin, studying its curves, the grain of the wood, the intricate carving of its scroll. Finally, she came to my workbench, where my newest creation was resting. She looked at it, then down at the battered case she was holding. With a deep sigh, she unlatched her case. The violin inside was a sad, broken thing. Its wood was cheap, its varnish dull, and I could see a long, poorly repaired crack running along its body. It was an instrument without a soul, incapable of producing the music I could see burning in her eyes. She must have seen the pity on my face. "She does not sing very well," she said softly, "but she is mine." And then she asked the question that would change my life. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know I cannot afford such a thing, but would you allow me to play one of yours? Just for a moment. I want to know what a true voice feels like." I should have said no. These were expensive instruments, commissioned by nobles and wealthy merchants. But I looked from her broken violin to the fierce, desperate passion in her eyes, and I could not refuse. I was a maker of voices. How could I deny one to a soul that so clearly needed to sing? Wordlessly, I took down a simple, unadorned violin I had recently finished. It was a good instrument, honest and true. I handed it to her. The moment she took it, everything changed. The shy, poor girl disappeared. In her place stood an artist. The way she held the instrument was not the way a student holds a tool. She held it like an extension of her own body. A lost part of herself now returned. Her posture straightened. A fire lit in her eyes. She lifted her bow, and she began to play. I have been a luthier my entire life. I have heard the greatest virtuosos of our time, but I have never heard anything like the sound that filled my small, dusty workshop that afternoon. It was not just music. It was a story of immense, heartbreaking sorrow, and a defiant, soaring joy. The music poured out of her, a raw, untamed force of nature. Her fingers did not just press the strings, they bled emotion onto them. Her bow did not just glide, it wept and it raged. She played with her eyes closed, her body swaying with the melody, completely lost to the world, a conduit for a beauty that was almost too powerful for the small room to contain. I stood frozen, a piece of sandpaper forgotten in my hand, my own heart aching with the sheer, painful beauty of the sound. I, a man who had spent his life working with silent wood, who understood the world through the logic of measurements and the science of acoustics, had just heard the soul I had always been trying to build, and it was living inside this small, fierce, unknown girl. The final note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering thing, before it slowly faded into the ticking of the clocks. She opened her eyes, and she was the shy girl once more, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She looked at the violin in her hands with a look of pure love. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Do not be sorry," I said, my voice hoarse. "Be a musician." From that day on, it became our silent ritual. Every Tuesday afternoon, she would come to my shop. I would let her play one of my finished violins. We rarely spoke. Words were clumsy, unnecessary things in the face of her music. I would simply work at my bench, and the sound of her playing would be the soundtrack to my work, filling the quiet space with a life, a passion it had never known. I was content with this arrangement, but as the months passed, a new, quiet, and impossible idea began to form in my heart. Her talent was a magnificent, wild bird, and the cheap, broken instrument she owned was a cage too small for its wings. I knew she could never afford one of my masterpieces, so I decided I would build one for her, in secret. It would be the greatest violin of my life, a vessel worthy of the soul I had heard in my shop that first day. It would not be a commission from a patron. It would be a commission from my own heart, a Luthier's secret serenade. The echo of Ange's music did not fade with the setting of the sun. It lingered in my workshop for days. It settled into the wood grain of the floorboards. It clung to the dusty air. It vibrated in the silent waiting bodies of the violins hanging on my wall. The shop, which had always been a place of quiet, diligent work, now felt like a concert hall after the performance is over, still humming with a phantom energy, a beautiful ghost of a sound. I would sit at my workbench, a piece of wood in my hand, and find my mind wandering. I have spent my entire life in the service of this craft. I have made instruments for dukes and for wealthy merchants, for famous virtuosos whose names were known throughout Europe. They paid well. They praised my work. But their relationship with their instruments was one of ownership, of mastery. They commanded music from the wood. But Anja, she did not command it. She unleashed it. She did not play the violin. She became one with it. The music did not come from her fingers, but from a place deeper, a place of profound joy and sorrow that I, in my quiet, ordered life, had never known. And I began to feel a new sense of purpose, a feeling that grew from a quiet thought into a solemn, unshakable conviction. Her talent was a magnificent, wild bird, capable of soaring to the heavens, and the cheap, cracked instrument she carried was a cage too small, too crude for its glorious wings. A bird like that does not deserve a cage. It deserves a perfect sky to fly in. I had patrons who would wait years for one of my instruments. I had a waiting list that could sustain me for the rest of my days. But in that moment, I realized I had only one true commission. It was not from a duke or a merchant. It was a commission from music itself, a silent, sacred task assigned to me the moment I heard her play. I would build my masterpiece, not for fame, not for gold, but for her, in secret. It would be the greatest work of my life, a vessel worthy of the soul I had heard in my shop that first day. The work began not at the workbench, but in the woodroom. This is a small, climate-controlled chamber at the back of my shop, a library of slumbering potential. Here, great blocks and planks of timber, sourced from forests all over the world, have been aging for decades, some even longer than I have been alive. The air in here is thick with the dry, sweet perfume of aged wood. the sharp, resinous scent of spruce, the warmer, almost spicy scent of maple, the dark, chocolatey smell of ebony. To others, it is a storeroom. To me, it is a choir, each piece of wood holding a silent, sleeping song. I did not choose the wood quickly. I spent an entire day in quiet communion with the timber. I was searching for two specific souls. For the top of the violin, the belly, the part that would become its voice, I needed a special piece of spruce. I ran my hands over dozens of planks, feeling the grain, smelling the wood, searching for the right one. Finally, I found it. A magnificent piece of alpine spruce from a high valley in the Italian Dolomites, where the cold winters make the wood grow slow and dense, its grain patterns tight and even. I had been saving it for more than 40 years, waiting for a worthy project. I lifted the heavy plank. It was light for its size. I held it to my ear and tapped it gently with my knuckle. The sound that came back was not a dull thud. It was a clear, bell-like tone, a pure, ringing note that seemed to hang in the still air forever. It was a singing wood. It had her clarity, her pure, soaring highs. This would be the voice. For the back and the ribs, I needed a different kind of character. I needed passion. I needed fire. I found it in a block of Bosnian maple, a piece I had acquired from a traveling merchant long ago. Its surface was a breathtaking spectacle of deep, shimmering waves of grain, a pattern known as flame. As I turned the block in the light, the flames seemed to move, to dance like a fire trapped within the wood. It was beautiful, wild, and unpredictable. It had a fire, the passion that burned beneath her shy exterior. This would be the soul. With the two chosen pieces resting on my workbench, my heart was filled with a quiet, reverent excitement. I did not use my standard templates, the ones I had perfected over years of work. This instrument had to be different. It had to be hers. I took a fresh sheet of parchment and a charcoal pencil. I began to draw the outline of the violin. I made the curves slightly more elegant, the body a fraction more slender than my usual model. I was designing it not for a man's powerful hands, but for her graceful, expressive form. I drew with a focus so intense that the world outside my window, the city of Vienna, the clatter of carriages, the entire 19th century, ceased to exist. There was only the parchment, the charcoal, and the emerging shape of my secret devotion. When the design was perfect, the real work began. The first cut. This is always the most terrifying moment for a luthier. It is the moment of irreversible commitment. For all my planning, all my listening to the wood, the moment the saw touches its surface, the wood's true character is revealed. It can be perfect, or it can hold a hidden flaw, a knot, a crack, that would render months of work useless. I placed the template on the block of flamed maple. I picked up my finest saw, its teeth sharp and precise. I took a deep, steadying breath. The workshop was utterly silent. Even the clocks on the wall seemed to have stopped ticking, holding their breath with me. I placed the saw on the line I had drawn, and I made the first gentle pull. The sound was a soft, satisfying zzz, a whisper of steel against wood, a perfect, paper-thin curl of pale maple, smelling of sweet sap and wild forests, fell onto the workbench. The journey had begun. I was no longer just a luthier. I was a creator in the quiet, solitary, and sacred service of a secret serenade. I would pour all the unspoken words, all the quiet admiration, all the love I could not express into this wood. I would build her a new voice, a voice that would allow her soul to finally, truly sing. The weeks that followed were a blur of sacred, secret work. My regular commissions, the repairs for the city's musicians, the new cello for the Baron, they all became a dull background noise. My true life began when I locked the shop door at dusk, lit the oil lamps, and turned to the 2 blocks of wood resting on my workbench. My spruce and my maple, her voice and her soul. The work of a luthier is a slow, patient, and sometimes brutal act of subtraction. You do not build a violin, you reveal it. You take a block of raw, silent wood, and you slowly, painstakingly carve away everything that is not the instrument. You listen, you feel, and you free the music that has been sleeping within it for centuries. I began with the back plate, the flamed maple. My hands, which knew the language of wood better than they knew the language of men, began to carve. With small, curved gouges and tiny, razor-sharp planes, I started to shape the gentle arching of the back. And as I worked, it was not the technical drawings on my wall that I was seeing. In my mind's eye, I saw her. I saw the way she would stand when she played, her back so straight, her shoulder tilted just so, as she cradled her own battered violin. I saw the graceful, elegant curve of her spine as she leaned into a particularly passionate passage of music, and my hands, as if guided by that memory, would follow that image. I shaped the wood, giving it a subtle, perfect curve that was not on any of my plans. It was not the curve of Stradivari or of Guarneri. It was the curve of her. Then came the top plate, the spruce, the belly of the instrument. This was where the voice would be born. The work here was even more delicate. I carved the wood down until it was almost paper thin in some places, measuring the thickness with my calipers 100 times, 1,000 times. I tapped it constantly with my fingertip, listening for its resonant frequency. For the moment, it would begin to sing back to me in its own clear, high voice. I was not just carving wood, I was tuning a soul. The most delicate part was carving the F-holes. They are not merely decorative. They are the lungs of the violin, the openings through which its voice will escape into the world. My hand, holding the small, sharp knife, had to be impossibly steady. A single slip, a single moment of hesitation, and the entire piece, weeks of work, would be ruined. As I carved their elegant, curving shapes, I thought of her. I thought of her mouth, the way it would open slightly when she played a particularly difficult passage, as if she was singing along with the music. These F-holes, I thought, they will be her lips. They will be the way her soul speaks to the world. And then the scroll, the beautiful, useless, purely artistic spiral at the very head of the instrument. It serves no acoustic purpose. Its only function is to be beautiful. It is the luthier's signature. I spent days on it, my smallest, sharpest knives following the spiraling pattern like a seashell or a budding fern. And as I carved, I thought of her hair, that wild, dark cloud that could not be tamed. I thought of her mind, so full of intricate, beautiful thoughts. This scroll was for her, a final, silent tribute. When all the pieces were carved and shaped, the body of the violin was ready to be assembled. But there was one final, secret ritual to perform. This was the part of the process that was mine and mine alone. Before I sealed the body of the violin, before I glued the spruce belly to the maple back, I took my finest quill pen and a small pot of permanent ink. The ink I used to sign my name on the labels within my instruments. My hand trembled for the first time in years. This felt more significant, more final than any signature I had ever written. On the raw, unvarnished wood of the inside of the back plate, near the place where the sound post, the soul of the violin, would stand, I wrote a single word, a word no one would ever see again, a word that would be forever sealed in the heart of the instrument, a secret shared only between me and the music. I wrote her name, Anja. I watched the black ink sink into the pale wood, and then I sealed the box. I glued the top plate to the ribs, closing her name inside its beautiful wooden cage forever. The final stage was the varnishing. It is a process that can take months. It is the process that gives the violin its skin, its color, its final layer of protection and beauty. My varnish is a secret recipe passed down through my family for generations. It is a mix of amber, of myrrh, of fragrant oils and resins. It has the color of liquid sunlight, of warm honey. I did not apply it with a brush. I applied it with the palm of my hand, layer after layer, day after day. It was a slow, gentle, repetitive motion, a caress. I would pour a small amount of the warm, fragrant varnish into my hand and smooth it over the wood in long, slow, loving strokes. It was like coaxing a blush onto pale skin. With each layer, the flames of the maple on the back of the violin seemed to grow deeper, more vibrant, as if a fire were slowly being kindled within it. I lost track of time. My world became the feel of the smooth wood under my hand, the intoxicating scent of the varnish, and the image of her face in my mind. Finally, after 30 coats, it was done. I strung the violin for the first time. I tightened the pegs, bringing each string up to its proper pitch. The instrument groaned and creaked, a newborn creature taking its first breath. And then I placed the bow upon the strings and drew it gently. The sound that emerged was not one I had created. It was the sound I had been chasing my entire life. It was a voice so rich, so deep, so full of a beautiful, heartbreaking sadness. It brought tears to my eyes. It was her voice. It was her soul. The violin was complete. My masterpiece. It lay on my workbench, beautiful and silent. A body waiting for the only person in the world who knew how to make it sing. A secret serenade, waiting for its musician. The violin was complete. It lay resting in its new, velvet-lined case on my workbench, the dark wood glowing with a deep, inner fire under the soft light of my workshop. It was, I knew with a quiet and certain heart, the finest instrument I had ever made. Its lines were perfect, its varnish flawless. It was a body without a soul, a silent vessel waiting for the one person in the world who could give it a voice, waiting for Anja. She arrived the following Tuesday, as she always did. The small bell above the door chimed, and she stepped inside, shaking the rain from her thin cloak. Her face was pale from the damp chill. She smiled a small, shy hello, her eyes immediately scanning the workshop for a violin to practice on. And then she saw it. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, fixed on the new, magnificent instrument lying in its open case. She took a hesitant step closer, then another, as if approaching a holy altar. "Master Jacob," she breathed, her voice full of a disbelieving awe. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Which duke, which prince, is the lucky man who will own such a masterpiece?" "He is a very powerful man indeed," I said, my own voice deliberately neutral, though my heart was pounding against my ribs. She reached out a hand, but stopped herself just short of touching the gleaming wood. The longing on her face was a physical thing, a silent, heartbreaking plea. "Before he comes to take it away," she whispered, looking at me, her stormy eyes full of a desperate hope. "Please, Master, may I play it just once? I want to know what perfection sounds like." I simply nodded. I could not have refused her if I had wanted to. This instrument was born from the memory of her music. Its only purpose was to meet its creator. With hands that trembled slightly, she lifted the violin from its velvet bed. She held it for a long moment, simply feeling its weight, its perfect balance. It settled into the curve of her shoulder as if it had been carved from her own body. It looked, in that moment, like it had finally come home. She lifted her bow, she took a deep breath, and she played. The sound that filled my small, dusty workshop was not of this earth. It was a sound I had heard only in my dreams, in my deepest moments of creative longing. It was the sound I had heard in the wood when I first tapped it, the sound I had been chasing my entire life. The voice of the violin was not just clear and powerful, it was alive. It wept with a sorrow so profound and soared with a joy so brilliant that the very air in the room seemed to shimmer. She was no longer a shy, poor girl. She was a force of nature, a conduit for all the beauty and pain of the world. And the violin, my violin, was no longer just wood and string and varnish. It was her voice. It was her soul, finally, truly, set free. The final note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering thing, before it slowly faded into the ticking of the clocks. She stood there, motionless, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She looked down at the violin in her hands with a look of utter, holy reverence. "I have never heard such a voice," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "The soul in this wood, it understands me." She clutched it to her chest for a moment. Then, with a look of deep sadness, she began to place it back in its case. "Wait," I said, my own voice hoarse. She stopped, looking at me with a question in her tear-filled eyes. Now came the moment for the noble lie, the kindest, most necessary lie I would ever tell. "The violin is not for a duke, Anja," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. It was commissioned by an anonymous patron, a man of great wealth who heard you play here many months ago. He believes a talent like yours should not be silenced by a broken instrument. She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't understand. His only condition, I continued, the lie flowing more easily now, was that the instrument must belong to the one artist who could make it truly sing. He does not wish to own it. He wishes only to hear it played throughout the world. It is yours, Anja, on loan, for as long as you make music. Her face crumbled. The disbelief, the shock, gave way to a wave of overwhelming, tearful joy and gratitude. She threw her arms around me, this gruff, old, dusty Luthier, and she sobbed into my shoulder. "Thank you," she cried, over and over again. "Thank you." I just stood there, patting her back awkwardly, my own heart both soaring with joy and breaking with the weight of my beautiful secret. And that was how it began. She left my shop that day, not just with a new violin, but with a new future. She went on to study at the great conservatories. She won competitions. She became what I always knew she would be, one of the greatest violinists of her generation. Her name, Anja, became known in all the great concert halls of Vienna, of Paris, of London. My name, Jakob, remained here in the quiet dust of my workshop. I never told her the truth. Sometimes, when she was playing in a nearby city, I would secretly attend her concerts. I would buy the cheapest ticket for a seat in the highest balcony, where I could see her, a small, radiant figure on the vast stage below, but she could not see me, and I would listen. I would listen as she made my violin sing, and the sound that filled the great, opulent halls was the sound of my own heart. It was my love, my devotion, my entire life's work, being played for the world through her magnificent talent. Everyone would applaud her, but only I knew the full truth. They were not just listening to her music, they were listening to my serenade, a silent love song from a humble luthier to his muse. And that was enough. It was more than enough. The note fades, but the memory remains, the memory of her final concert, the last time I heard the violin's voice under her hands. The sound is no longer just music. It is a lullaby, a story of a love that was given away freely, a love that found its voice not in words, but in the soul of a violin, a beautiful, peaceful sound, a quiet, final note, a gentle, restful sleep. The greatest love stories are not always the ones that are spoken. Sometimes they are the ones that are crafted, built, and given away, living on, not in memory, but in the beauty they bring to the world. Thank you for listening to the Luthier's Secret Serenade tonight. I hope its quiet devotion has brought you a sense of profound peace. May your rest be deep and your dreams be filled with beautiful, gentle music. Sleep well.